Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitter's acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shaking, cocktail fans? Welcome to episode 178 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Modern Bar Cart CEO Eric Kozlik. Thanks for joining us for another interview episode where we track down the best and brightest minds in the spirits and cocktail world so that we can share their secrets with you. This time around, we're expanding our scope to include fermented beverages, in particular, cider. I had the great pleasure of chatting with authors and cider buffs Dan Pucci and Craig Cavallo, who are about to release a book that I am very excited about called American Cider. To me, it's the book that the American beverage world didn't know it desperately needed. It traces fermented apple beverages through the temporal and physical landscape of our nation and alerts us to cider trends and production legacies that are right here in our own backyards, just waiting to be discovered. And guys, I know I'm way more excited about this than a grown man should be, but this book has maps, hand-illustrated, whimsical yet informative maps. If you're down in the dumps about not being able to leave your home that much or travel during the pandemic, these beautiful little cartographies are perfect for giving your brain that little chemical rush that comes from imagining yourself in a new place. That, and they tell you where all the cider is, which is important. But before we part the sea of supermarket apples to make way for the sharp, sweet, and bitter cider varieties that are on the rise, let's take a moment so that you can make yourself a drink. This episode's featured cocktail is the Bicicleta, which we talk about during the lightning round for this interview. To make it, you'll need 2 ounces of Campari, 2 ounces of a dry white Italian wine like Pinot Grigio or Verdicchio, and some soda water to top it all off. The nice thing about the Bicicleta is that it's a built drink. You take your Campari and your wine, you pour them into a highball glass, add ice, top with sparkling water, and garnish with half an orange wheel. It's simple, delicious, and to the point. According to Punch, this spritz variation was named after the old Italian men on bikes who might have a hard time riding in a straight line as they return home from a few drinks at the bar during the afternoon. And although we might still be in winter's grasp here on the east coast of the US, there's no rule out there that says you can't fantasize about summer spritzes all year round. So now that you've got a drink in hand, let's turn our attention back to the interview. In this fruity, fermented conversation with Craig Cavallo and Dan Pucci, authors of American Cider, some of the topics we discuss include how each of these gentlemen fell in love with apples and cider through their shared experiences in the New York hospitality scene and their happy proximity to the Hudson Valley, one of our nation's most prolific apple hubs. Why cider developed differently in America than it did in Europe, and how different geographic, cultural, and economic factors contributed to various dark ages and revivals in the apple world. Of course, we talk about different exciting apple varietals with cool names like Northern Spy and Black Twig, as well as the 4 different categories that all cider apples can be placed into. We explain the different decisions that cider makers encounter on their way to delicious ferments, including yeast, terroir, and naming conventions. We offer tips for sourcing excellent cider for your home bar, and even how to start experimenting with making your own cider. And of course, much, much more. We'll have a link in the show notes page that you can follow to order your copy of American Cider, which is going to be released in the next month or so. But while you're waiting for this book and all its beautiful little maps, I hope you enjoy this fascinating preview chat with authors Dan Pucci and Craig Cavallo. Dan and Craig, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Thanks for being here.
So let's just start off here by having you both introduce yourselves so our listeners know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
This is Craig. I co-author with Dan on the book in question on American Cider. Quick background, Dan and I met in New York City working in food and beverage, restaurants, wine stores, and the like, and became fast friends Um, my time in New York was all kind of restaurant work, front of house, back of house, managing, serving, a bit of everything. And then I took to food writing, interning, and then kind of on staff for Saveur as their digital staff writer for a bit, and sort of left the city as my last job as a writer, and landed up here in the Hudson Valley and now run a cafe with my wife and business partner.
Very nice. Dan.
Yeah, so kind of add on to Craig there. We met probably almost over 10 years ago now, working in food and beverage. I continue to work in food and beverage here in New York City. Besides doing this amazing book, I have a consulting business that does human resources for hospitality businesses and all the nitty gritty back end stuff to restaurants that nobody wants to do, but it's so very important.
Yeah, for sure. And pretty nice little mention there in the front of your book. You are apparently Kara Newman's go-to person when she has a question about cider.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was in one of her books for some cocktails and things like that back then.
Mm-hmm.
No, great. Yeah, and for a long time, I back in 2015, I helped open up Wassail, which was a cider-focused restaurant and bar. And kind of from there, kind of really got fully immersed into the cider world in a really intense way. And that restaurant closed in 2017. That restaurant closed, but it was a good run for a few years.
Yeah. So this book is a little bit different than some of the texts that we normally feature in that it is over 300 pages. It is, I'm not saying nothing to bash any of the other books that we've had on the show, but it's a bit more of a tome. It's a bit more of a sort of a cross between a history and I guess a really specific region by region stepwise look at what cider is, how it evolved, and so in that respect it's a bit intimidating, but I think we can pull out some of the key themes here as we go along. So why don't you both kind of take me through how you individually came to really love apples, and then how your love for and appreciation of the ferments and distillates that comes from these lovely fruits led you to conceive American Cider.
We both come from a background of wine. We both worked in Italian wine for many years. And one of the interesting things about cider, kind of really hooked me. It's unknown, and it's unknown, and the pursuit of discovery that's really taking place right now, especially here in the United States. So much of like the established wine culture that we were operating with, it was all about like kind of relearning things that people had already taught and already learned, just kind of reading out of books and just kind of like absorbing information that had already been taught, and nothing was new. New stuff was happening, but it was somewhat distant and not necessarily representative of what we were at access to. And so cider is fascinating because of because of the cutting edge is happening right now, right here, and it's so much of it is still really unknown. Like we don't know half of anything, like of what apples and cider could possibly do in this country. So really, that kind of like pursuit of discovery and exploration really kind of got into me and got me super curious about how cider works, how apples work, and how this community works. So once you get involved in the cider community, that's what I can say. It's hard to get out, and it's a really fun and exciting community to be a part of.
Exactly how I got here. The opportunity for the book came to Dan through Dan's connections, and Dan didn't have much of a writing experience. And so because I did, he asked me to help him on the project, and that's kind of how I got hooked. But again, Dan's work at Wassail, kind of, he was introduced to the national community, and it's a very fascinating and supportive and humble community. And so I very much like people as much as I like fermented beverages and apples. And for me, the project kind of, it sunk and it stuck to my soul because of the human element. Apples can exist without us, but it's kind of the relationship with humans and apples that I find fascinating. And like Dan said, the category of cider is shifting, and we have even made jokes since the book was submitted that we could probably already write a second edition just because of all that's changed since then.
Yeah, I love the idea of getting into cider because it has relatively high cap space in terms of what there is to learn and to continue to make progress on relative to the wine world, which I think is probably the best comparison, although it is certainly not a one-to-one comparison. You know, we can speak about terroir with apples and with grapes. We can speak about different varietals, perhaps different sort of bigger buckets that those varietals then fall into. So I think there's a lot to compare, but I think like you, I'm primarily interested in the differences between the wine world and the cider world, because you go to a restaurant and who comes to the table? Well, a sommelier, not an apple sommelier, right? So it's a grape, it's a wine sommelier, not an apple sommelier. So there's definitely a huge difference in my mind between the cider world and the wine world, and hopefully as we go here, we can kind of pick out some of those nuances and share them with our listeners, because our listeners do tend to be the curious folks, the people who go out of their way to try new things as opposed to just sitting with the same bottle that they've enjoyed for years and years. So what was the, I guess, ultimate project of American Cider? Like, what is, maybe not the thesis, but what is it designed to teach? And did that project evolve as you wrote it?
Yeah, I would say the primary thesis is to provide context for what's happening today, and to kind of provide context and provide a record for what's going on today, because the cider industry has changed a lot in the last 10 years, and so much of the narrative that was taking place was looking back to an earlier history, and like it wasn't necessarily lining up. Like what I was learning and finding out as a intense cider person versus what the marketing narrative was coming out of a lot of cideries didn't quite line up all the way, and I wanted this to basically provide context for like the cider community today, so that somebody could enjoy this book, pick it up, read it, and it's not necessarily for the first-time cider drinker, but for somebody who is engaged in beverage to like learn this context, and that these new, even though cideries are only 3 or 4 years old, that the products they're making are not out of a vacuum, but they're from this tradition and this culture.
Mm-hmm. And because that was sort of a daunting task to try to frame that in a digestible way for readers, we sort of decided to break it down into the 8 regions that the book is in, and those regions are basically where there has been an apple and cider culture since Europeans came here, and where those cultures still remain, and sort of how today is standing on the foundation laid by yesterday to provide this product for today's consumers.
So I hope in the text we kind of linked back the history that we talk about. We talk about very select histories of each part of the country, and then link those back to what's happening today. To the idea of like this. So it's not a comprehensive. We don't talk about every cider. There's 1,000 producers of cider in the United States today. We don't talk about all of them, but the idea is we talk about the ones we do talk about. We link back to this earlier history, whatever that happened to be.
Yeah, and I think that maps on, right? Because whether you're talking about the beer world, the spirits world, the cocktail world, we see two sort of perhaps contradictory impulses, right? We see the impulse to link your brand or your product back to a tradition that existed perhaps during something like a golden age of cocktails back from the 1890s to the 1920s, or a spirits making tradition kind of similar to that, or we see the contrary impulse to maybe do something that pushes the envelope of what we've seen thus far, and we can maybe think of the bars and the bartenders who've done more of like the molecular mixology in that space recently. So it makes sense that there's going to be a similar thing with cider, right? There's a lot of, like, again, as you said, cap space to do new things, and yet there's a lot of history that people aren't familiar with. Now, one place that I really want to pause right now is your maps. Can you talk to me about the maps that you included in this book? How did you decide on that style? Like, how are the maps designed to inform the text? Because I'm a map guy and I love books with maps.
So the maps were done by this guy Jim Sly, who is formerly was a sommelier here in New York City for a long time. And I first knew him originally because he used to be a sommelier at a restaurant called Pro and Ash on the Bowery, which was like very it was a very like sceney, influential wine place. Probably like in 2013 to 2000, and I think it closed in maybe 16 or 17. And I met him. He first came because I was pretty close to West Hill. He used to come after work, and I knew him from there. He now has this whole thing post-COVID of like these online wine classes called Children's Wine Atlas, which is really amazing. Jim's a great educator and a really awesome dude. And I talked to him like, hey, I want these maps. And I like the way he messes with scale and messes with to kind of tell a story. And they're very much they look like the kind of like young adult fantasy novel maps, which is kind of what I don't know. They were great.
Yeah, I really like them, and I didn't recognize that whole messing with scale that you're referencing, but now that I think about it, they are kind of almost stretched out in a way that might make it feel like you're viewing them on a curved surface like a globe, and they do a good job. So I'm thinking of your New York maps, for example. So you have a map of the Finger Lakes region, and then you have a map of Long Island and more of South Central New York. Where Angry Orchard, for example, is doing a lot of their work, and it's great. I think that the impulse to map is really important here because unlike the wine world, perhaps the European wine world, where wine regions, maybe not in reality, but seem to abut one another. You can't go somewhere in France without stepping over a line between one region and another region that's right next to it, perhaps. But these regions seem like there's a little bit more space between them. And so it's useful as we transition, I think, from space to have these maps to set the tone so that when you make a reference to a particular type of apple or a particular growing region or some of the geology, right? There are various escarpments and soil types that are referenced in these maps and in the text as well. It's great to be able to just flip back a couple pages and find it with your finger and say like, right there. Okay, that's what they're talking about. So I think the maps for me are almost like a character in this book or characters, multiple. So I really enjoy that. But I guess if that's a good summary of the map, is there any way we can talk a little bit about how as time flows from the past to the present and our country was settled from east to west, how these different cider regions maybe evolved in a high level way?
Yeah. So I guess sort of like preliminary info to kind of understand the proliferation of apples in the country is that apples don't grow true from seed. So you plant an apple seed of, say, Granny Smith, and you don't get a Granny Smith apple. So in that truth, as Europeans were coming here and settling here, they came from these apple cultures, so they brought seeds with them because they're lightweight, they don't take up space, they can survive the voyage, yada yada, and they plant them when they get to the new coast. And so what comes up is all these unique varieties, unique to the world and to the regions where they were, and then people sort of rely on those as kind of this familiar notion of what was from home. But they were just very much a part of, from the early 17th century, very much a part of the new founding country's fabric. Through time, these things become more understood. The book starts in the South, the Southeast, and for various reasons, which Dan can kind of, go into, there was larger plantation systems there. The need for slavery and indentured servitude. So you had these big swaths of land, and you had aristocratic elites that were owning most of this land. And so that sort of was in tandem with more subsistence farmers who didn't have access to wealth and to knowledge. And so those two early cider drinking experiences were very different. I guess just to kind of follow the book briefly, we just go up to the Northeast. The Northeast is much rockier. It's much smaller. There's not swaths of flat land. So you have smaller orchards. You still have these seedling apples. But in the Northeast, because of the tight space, the lack of land, but there, waterways and things, you have the development of markets. And so markets start to...
Industrialization.
Sure. So, these are just sort of like, it is sort of challenging to summarize succinctly, and hopefully I'm not rambling, but basically in each region, there are developments in agriculture, and these things influence and inform what apples people are planting and the cider that comes from those.
As Europeans move from east to west across the country, they basically do what they know, and it's not necessarily good or bad. Not necessarily people farm what they know, and not necessarily in the best way possible. So wherever Europeans go west, they grow wheat and dairy cows, and apple is kind of the second thing after that. And there definitely is the history is very much about people trying to make money, and it's about people in the 19th century is all about people trying to make money, and cider was a part of that for a little bit, but by 1840, it's not really anymore. And cider is effectively out of the mainstream by the mid 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how cider and apple ferments and distillates are, they sort of experienced a dark age, for lack of a better term. And is there any way that you can help our listeners understand why that is? I know that it does have some ties to things that we've spoken about before on this podcast, like the temperance movement, like prohibition. But it seems like the dark age that apples and cider experienced was actually beginning to take hold before that. So can you help us understand why that happened?
So it's basically economics. Basically, growing cider prices were low and cheap. It was a cheap product for most part. So if you're growing fruit in the 18th century or the 19th century, you're like today, your most valuable thing you can grow it for is for fresh consumption. So if you're putting in a 10-acre orchard, you're going to make your best money by selling the fruit for somebody to eat. The same today. If you have 100 acres of apple trees, you make much more money selling it at the grocery store than you do selling it for cider. So the drive and the push is really to grow for fresh fruit, especially on a commercial scale. So places like in Western New York and in Gettysburg, it's all about processing, but those are all value-added products that people do that were basically dried apples in Sebastopol were made more money for the farmers and had a higher value to them than cider ever would. So people who were putting in farms and orchards did them for purposes that were definitely not for cider, because that was the least return on their investment.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a parallel too, just with people leaving the rural countryside, which is where you need the space for orchards. As people were settling closer to kind of like developed towns, urban centers, it just sort of cider made much less sense in the American fabric.
Yeah, it's easier to make if you're a upstart city like Milwaukee. It's a lot easier to brew beer in the city to deliver to everybody who's working in the city than it is to make cider. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense to bring apples into the city to make cider there to then distribute it. It's just it's a lot easier to just like bring in grains, ferment beer, and hand it out. Then it's just a lot simpler and easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm hearing some echoes here from a Tales of the Cocktail seminar I attended a year and a half ago about apple distillates. And the one striking fact that I took away from that seminar was the amount of money it costs to produce a liter or whatever volume of grain-based distillate relative to a fruit-based distillate. Oh, yeah. And it's ridiculous. It's something like like 4 to 8 times more expensive to produce a fruit distillate than a grain distillate. And yet when you walk into the store, you pick up a bottle of Laird's Applejack and then you pick up a bottle of whiskey and you look at the price tags and they're like pretty close. Like there's no
Yeah,
8
crazy.
times multiplier on it. So it's just, is it more of a passion project for people who are dedicated to producing ciders and innovating and really diving deep on the history of the ciders in their region? Are they propelled more by a passion for the product than a desire to make money?
I think it's both. Like people are trying to find sustainable businesses for themselves in, especially in rural environments, and I think a really important part in the last few years has been the influence of the regenerative agriculture movement, especially here in the Northeast and in California and the Northwest as well. And those, or even like first of all, regenerative agriculture and people are starting farms to create products that can make the farm sustainable. And if you're having a small farm, cider is a product that you can potentially make on a small scale and sell commercially, and it can make sense and it can be a viable business. So I think some people approach it from the land stewardship angle. They can do this as a way to help preserve the land and make a rural agricultural business sustainable and viable, because other kinds of farming are not necessarily sustainable or viable. Like just vegetable farming's a lot of work and really intensive and not necessarily profitable. And this is something they can do to do that. Or on the other hand, people are tapping into existing resources. So places like in the Northwest or in actually everywhere kind of people grow apples. The largest thing people grow apples and make cider are tapping into existing resources. So like in Western New York, there's this giant swaths of orchard that go to mott's, and people can just tap into that mott supply and make cider out of it instead, and maybe offer them some more money to it. In the last few years, those big growers are actually starting to plant more cider varieties because they see that as a potential market, and they can get more for their crop. They grow golden russet than if they grow Fuji for mott's.
Right. Well, you brought up this distinction between cider apples and what we can call food apples or eating apples, whether that's going to be apple juice, applesauce, fresh apples to eat from your hand. I wonder if you can give our listeners an understanding of what distinguishes a quote cider apple from the ones that they can walk into the grocery store and pick up off of the apple pyramid.
Grocery store apples they're designed and they're bred for fresh eating and sort of exclusively that. So you want juice, you want sugar, you want snap, you want crisp, you want that, the sensation of biting into an apple. They're one-dimensional in that sense. Cider apples have a lot more complexity to them. And kind of to go back to the comparison to wine, you have tannin and acid in apples just like you do in grapes. And these things come from the flesh and from the skin and the juice. There's an analogy I always like to use is you don't see Merlot grapes at the grocery store and you don't ferment with Thompson seedless grapes. So the same is true for apples. You don't see, say, depending on where you are, you don't tend to see like Harry Master's Jersey at the grocery store or Ashmead's Kernel. It's McIntosh, Cortland Empire, the few that we all know. So cider fruit to that end is just more complex. Polyphenols, the science of it is something I'm not familiar with, but there's more going on when those things are fermented, that they express themselves in much more nuanced and complex ways. At the same time, there are different camps on, fermenting these apples like McIntosh, Granny Smith, and what those bring to the table, just like they're very aromatic to eat, fresh out of hand. Those aromatics tend to come through in cider. So you don't, it's cider makers are still kind of finding the balance of what they like to ferment and produce versus what the consumer wants. But also kind of the balance between, either single varietal Kingston black cider or something that's got dessert fruit blended into it. So all apples can be fermented and make cider, of course. And there's kind of a nuance and a delicate dance to find a balance of complexity and aroma and all the great things that make cider.
And then in the cider world, there are varieties that are specifically grown and raised and bred to make cider with, whether that has to say tannins or acid or polyphenol, whatever. They're not meant to eat you out of hand. So like in places like England, they actually have a massive surplus of cider apples, which don't really have any other market value besides going into cider.
Yeah.
Well, here we have a lot more. We have a lot more eating apples that some of them make for good cider.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's not that you can't take a Macintosh, for example, and use it in a cider. It's just that just needs to be kind of an intentional decision relative to the other types of apples that you're perhaps blending into your cider. Yeah. And I like the 4 large buckets in the book that you present for us. There's sharp and sweet apples, referring to sugar and acidity. Malic acid, of course, being the type of acid that we're dealing with primarily, with maybe a little bit of ascorbic acid in there. And then you have the further, development of those in bitter sharp and bitter sweet apples. And so you present a 2x2 matrix that just allows us to walk up to any apple, look at how much sugar, acid, and tannins it contains, and then being able to kind of place that on its place in the map. So that was particularly useful for me as I tried to put on my cider maker's glasses and say like, well, if I'm about to go into this project of making a cider, what is the decision tree that I'm going to follow? So having obviously worked with a lot of these cider makers, how would you kind of explain to our listeners the process of developing a cider as a product with a specific flavor profile, and like if you were a cider maker like presented with this project of putting a new product to market right now, like what are the steps that you need to go through to develop that flavor?
Well, the most important part is figuring out your sourcing. It's like where's your apple coming from? Whether it is you're buying that from bulk juice from the Northwest, from Washington State, or that's buying from local orchards wherever you happen to be. And those orchards are going to have relatively different apples depending on where you are in the country. Like here in New York State, we have lots of, in the Hudson Valley, we have tons of like Fuji's and Galas and things like that. They're meant for fresh market consumption. I think Craig said Macintosh and Cortlands. While in Western New York, they have a surplus of Northern Spy that used to go to Mott's. That's a really great cider variety that's also good for making pies and things like that. And same in Michigan. Michigan and Western New York have pretty similar apple varieties. So I think it's about understanding what your resources are in terms of like where you're sourcing your products from, raw materials. And then from there, you can use those to kind of dictate what your blend's going to taste like. And I think for the large part, you can't, cider apples need making cider, you can influence the taste of them, but you really can't change their flavor profile and things like that. So you need to like, so it's first sourcing and then figuring out where to, what kind of cider you're going to make from there. In your processing, you're barrel aging or fermenting an oak or going with a malolactic, how you're sparkling it. Those are all choices you need to make, but it all starts with where your apples come from and what you're using.
Mm-hmm. Now, so I think it's very tempting to talk about varietals with apples just because they have such fun names and interesting morphologies and colors. But I'd love to talk a little bit about terroir because there's just a bit of a difference when you think about wine, for example, where you've got these grapes and, we have the history of winemakers intentionally, quote unquote, stressing the vines so that they dive deeper into the ground and suck up more of those different minerals and the water from whatever the native aquifer happens to be. As opposed to thinking of an apple tree, it's just a different organism absorbing nutrients and other aspects of terroir differently than a grapevine would. So is there a different way to think about apple terroir as opposed to grape terroir, or is it largely kind of like a similar thing? you get the weather, you get the soil, you get a touch of human intervention, and that's your terroir for that region.
It's pretty similar in terms of what you just said about like the stresses and things like that. I would add to that like research is still out. Like we don't exactly know how to best grow these varieties. Like Cornell is doing a lot of work right now in terms of like understanding like how to prune them and like if you maybe that hairy Master Jersey needs a different style of pruning and maintenance than like a Fuji would, and that like growing apples for cider is maybe different than growing apples for fresh eating, and they have different needs. And understanding that thing and that's kind of where we're at right now. And I think when thinking about cider, though, in addition to that, we also have to think about the human element and kind of where that culture comes about from, and where that cider exists in terms of the market, because it's not like part of my terroir rant usually includes that for someone who worked in Italian wine for many years, Italian wine always presents itself as being this immortal, timeless beverage, which is the most like terrible bullshit you've ever heard. Like those are all like Italian wine we drink today is definitely not Italian wine that people were drinking 30 years ago. It's definitely not the wine people were drinking 100 years ago. But they've sold it to us as like this is the way we've always done things. This is how it is. And it's like the most amazing amount of bullshit that everyone drinks. It's pretty great. So in cider world, I always think Nat West of Reverend Nat Cidery in Portland, Oregon. He makes a lot of intensely flavored ciders that are very process driven. Well, he'll like take grape apple juice and make it like he'll go to breweries and make it like they're like they're doing on IPAs, or he'll take things and age them over odd things for a long period of time. He's like, we talked to him the book. He was like, "Oh, I'm over flavors. Like I'm all about weird processes now of how we do things." And but his idea is that like, well, yeah, but I'm from Portland, Oregon here, and part of the terroir of Portland, Oregon is beer and innovation and weird. Like I can go to Portland, I can drink delicious, well-made lagers, crazy IPAs, and the best sour beers in the entire world. And so, like, of course, that's going to have an influence on how cider is presented and how we contextualize that culture. And it's super important to realize. And I think, and when looking at the rest of the country, it's the same thing. Like looking at the beer culture in Michigan and to how their ciders are presented there, and the resources that exist there from these giant old processing orchards that make apple pies, frozen apple pies, and now make cider. Like that has an important influence and onto what the ciders actually are, not just like because of how the soil is.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems like, I'm making an assumption here, but it seems like yeast is also a fertile place to play around. I mean, there's the two types of yeast approaches you can take are obviously wild fermentation and the more controlled fermentation using a particular strain or perhaps even a particular strain that is proprietary to a given cidery. Is there anything going on in the yeast space that our listeners should know about in terms of going out and visiting a cidery and being able to contextualize like the way that they're going about fermenting this beverage?
Yeah. Like yeast is a thing. It's definitely less of a thing than it is it's both more of a thing and less of a thing than it is in the beer world, or in the wine world. It's very much a thing. People are very much passionate and opinionated about their processes and what they use. And like last week at CiderCon, which was the big annual convention last week, which was all remote, somebody presented this guy Lee Reeves, who's a Japanese cider importer in Japan. He presented this like cider that was made from Bartlett pears that was fermented with wasp's yeast that was cultivated. That was like pretty weird. I've never known it. And I looked it up. There are like some weird beers made from wasp yeast, which is weird. But it's a mixed space. I don't know, Craig. What do you think about yeast stuff?
I think and there's probably something to be said. We didn't really.
We were less focused on process for this book.
Yeah. But there's probably something to be said that, if somebody's making a relatively small batch of cider, say it's 2,000 gallons or whatever, and that's their livelihood, you may find a higher likelihood of pitching yeast to secure that product and make sure you don't lose money, and so you can pay your bills. But there's also kind of just the ethos that, the term natural winemaking or cider making, of just kind of native yeasts, letting them ferment naturally. The argument that it sort of preserves some of the more inherent flavors in the apple comes down to, I think, just cider maker philosophy about whether to pitch or not.
Yeah, it definitely divides the community, but at the same time, like, it was very much an intense point of conversation a few years ago, and I feel like it's less so in the last few years. And I think the biggest thing that's changed in that is the access to apples. Like, we're having more apple conversations now. Like, a few years ago, people were much more about, like, we're having a yeast conversation because the apple conversation was kind of fixed, or was fixed because they're like, I got apples, whatever I can get, it's what I got, and that's what I'm doing. And now the apple access has changed the last few years. We're getting better varieties online. Then the focus has changed a little more to focusing more on varieties more so than the yeast.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about how much is changing, and I guess the example that you just gave is an example of how that change is a little bit unpredictable. In some cases, like, who a couple of years ago would have predicted that the conversation would now be about varietals as opposed to, still being on the yeast conversation. So that's interesting to me, and it brings up something that you mentioned in the kind of the wrap up of your book, the conclusion, which is I love the title that you chose, and so ... A lovely way to sum things up. But in that conclusion, you mentioned that cider inhabits a liminal space, a transitional space. And I'd love to just hear your thoughts on liminality, and if you just talk about it, because it seems like it's very important to the way that you both sort of agreed to frame this book.
Great that you pointed that out, and as you're kind of talking about it, I find myself thinking more about it just from it's sort of coming out when we were writing it, and now kind of thinking about it. But yeah, sort of like what we've talked about in the interview here is just how in transition cider is, the beverage. It is not, it can be defined currently, but it is in no means definitive. And it's just shifting as people are learning, and there's new fruit growing, being put in the ground, and it'll grow, and the access to fruit will increase, and that fruit will vary, and inherently that changes the profile of the cider. So kind of goes back to our shared love of just the community, even outside cider. It's a collaboration, and it's not something that just like one cider maker in state X can just decide and define what cider is going to look like in the future. It's this collaborative thing where farmers are planting trees and people are tending to these orchards, and then people are fermenting the juice and the consumer is providing feedback. So it's interesting that there may be a cider making legacy in the country. There's no sort of legacy like you might find in winemaking in, older European countries, or even young ones here, like how there's the argument of a, Finger Lakes wine legacy or Sonoma County and the like. We're still very much looking to define cider, but then again, maybe part of cider's definition is that it's not a definable category.
Yeah, I'm going to give credit though. The liminality for cider is definitely something we borrow from our friend Leif Sundstrom of Sundstrom Cider. He very much he has a cider called liminal, and it's very much always he really seeded that into my brain in terms of like thinking of this in-betweenness of cider, and it doesn't quite fit into where anybody wants it to, and it's constantly changing and constantly evolving, and it's the in-between of kind of expectations, like it and when people are willing to engage with it too, it's changing and it's evolving, and I looking back talking about varieties now, like it's like in the future the conversations are going to be framed around not only varieties, but like it's going to be a terroir conversation, and we're preparing ourselves for a terroir conversation, for like not only like what does this variety taste like, but what does this variety taste like when it's grown here? I have a talk I've done a couple of times now. Our friend Darlene Hayes, who's a researcher, professional, and everything else, Renaissance woman out in Sebastopol. And we've done this starting, I think, from something that was 2016, I think we did it for the first time. And we've done it probably like 4 times since then, where we present Newtown Pippin in a lot of different contexts, where basically we will source the apples and ciders made from those apples, and we'll taste them all. So in the consolidated version, we have 8 apples and we have like 6 ciders and 6 apples, and we'll taste them all and recognize the difference between them. Like we have 2 from New York we usually work with. We have 1 from Virginia, 1 from Hood River in Oregon, and 2 from California, and really like understand that there are very different terroir differences between these ciders, even though they're processed in a relatively similar manner, and the apples are grown in a relatively are grown differently. You can kind of taste these like interesting how much the beverages are. It's the same apple. Like Newtown Pippin has this like very much like baked bread, pear, bright, clean, fruity feel to it. But like how it definitely changes depending on where it's grown.
Yeah.
And it varies a lot. And like we had a bunch of ciders that our first time we did that, where we sourced like 18 ciders for them. We all got really drunk. We tasted like 4 ciders that were all grown in the same orchard in Hudson Valley outside in Santa Cruz, and how like we could identify like this apple came from this block, and like this one was harvested at this date, and this one was harvested like 3 weeks later, and it was like just like crazy. Like it was very different in terms of how it all like played out, and it's we've done that talk a few times now. And it's been really fascinating to see people's reaction to it, and like there's a spectrum of flavor, and like the New York ciders start at one end of the spectrum, and then it kind of goes to New York style, and the California at the very end, and like there's a spectrum of flavor there, and they're all kind of in the same flavor, but there's a spectrum, which is interesting to see.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience with agave spirits with Lou Bank out of Chicago, who was able to kind of set up a similar tasting and identify, like here's 2 different agave distillates that are made using the same agave varietal, but made in 2 different places. And so I think there's a lot to be gained by doing that sort of comparison. And I really love that you're anticipating and preempting the growing trend in terroir there. I guess just to summarize what I've been hearing from you two, it seems like apples and cider, especially when compared to, like you said, the falsely calcified or falsely cut and dry categories of Italian wines, let's say, compared to these very cut and dry, very boxy categories and descriptors that we use in the wine world, it seems like apples are fidgety. They don't sit still for us. They're differently difficult to cultivate than grapes are. And, going back to our cap space conversation, there's just so much blue sky above us that it's maybe not even necessarily very useful to try and make hard and fast categories and assertions in this space just yet. And I think that probably makes some people uncomfortable. I could see a lot of very successful sommeliers getting very frustrated and a little bit bamboozled by the world of apples. So I think it's fitting that we're having this conversation right now in this very liminal time in our country's history and culture. And I think, for me, when I'm next time I'm at the liquor store or cruising the online offerings of the various fine beverage importers around me, I'm going to keep my eye out for cider because it seems like an appropriate thing to be thinking about and drinking during this time. So that's my big takeaway. And you guys can feel free to comment on that. Or I would also love to just wrap up the main portion of the interview by giving some folks at home ways that they can start playing around with cider, whether that's from a strict consumer basis or perhaps I know, Craig, you've done some experiments yourself. Maybe for our fermentation freaks out there, if you can maybe give a few tips, that'd be great as well.
Yeah, sure. And kind of going back to the first thing you addressed there of just these like more boxy beverage cultures. It's fun to see what these producers are releasing. Like there is no, oh, cool, I can't wait for producer X to release this wine again this year. It's like, oh, let's see what so-and-so decided to work with last fall and is releasing this spring. And it's kind of, you can follow that cider maker's journey through their, what they decide to make. And that's fun. It's very exciting. But like you said, it could make some people uncomfortable. But I think it's more of a continued conversation that's more of a two-way street to engage with these differences year after year and provide feedback so everybody can learn versus come to expect the same thing and then sort of take away some of the guesswork.
To hop onto that too, like the American Cider Association put out, I'd probably be like 3 or 4 years ago, put out a style guide that changed every year for a few years. Like our style guide, we have like heritage cider and we have modern cider, and we have hop cider and flavored cider, and they basically like 2 years ago said like, we can't do that.
And Eric, to your point about home cider making adventures, my setup is I have a countertop juicer, and that is
it's a limited thing.
Yeah, it very much obliterates the fruit. It aerates it quite a bit. I've done no science like testing. This is all just my own curiosities. And living in the Hudson Valley, I have access to amazing fruit in any direction. So I take advantage by buying bushels or 2 bushels at a time. And then juicing it and just letting it ferment naturally just to see sort of how it behaves and how it expresses itself. So if listeners, you have juicers and curiosity and maybe not access to apples, go to the grocery store and buy apples and juice them and ferment them. Find a farm stand, and if you have unpasteurized juice, somebody does the crushing and pressing for you. Get an airlock, put it over a container, sanitize, keep things clean, let it ferment, taste it along the way, and when it tastes like either vinegar, put it on salad. If it successfully ferments, then drink it with your friends. But yeah, it's fun to kind of just learn.
Yeah, the Claude Jolicoeur's New Cider Maker's Handbook is definitely the best and the best cider making resource. It's something that you could pick up and enjoy and read as an amateur person, but like it's also like very useful for technically. And it's also going to be it's a nice book, and that's going to be all you need to know about how to make cider. That and Ben Watson's Cider Hard and Sweet are the other one that's kind of similar. But like we definitely talk about making cider in the book, but we don't focus on it because we're not cider makers. There are much better people who are equipped to about how to make cider. We're much more about how to understand it.
Yeah. Now, just the last follow-up here, in terms of somebody who wants to widen their exposure to different American ciders, is it going to be most useful for them to look for the producers and try and go out of their way to buy them straight from the producers? Or is it going to be more useful, do you think, to look at try and find like the best, most high-level liquor store in their region? Because I know that both liquor stores and producers, depending on where they are now shipping due to COVID. So I'm wondering if this process of locating interesting ciders has changed since the pandemic.
Yeah, so I would say for sure, like retailers are definitely a great way to start. There's definitely some really good brands that are sold across the country, especially if you're in DC. There's lots of interesting stuff that gets into the DC market because of all your weird laws there, or lack of laws there. I would say definitely there's a website called shopciders.com, which is a aggregate service through Vino Shipper. Basically lists every single cider, and you can basically you're still ordering from individual producers, but it's a good way to kind of start and find things that are interesting. It's not necessarily the most. It'll take some digging, but it's definitely a way to find producers and see what's interesting. There are other like local regional ones, like this Press by Press, I think it's called, which is out of Seattle or Portland, but that's like the Northwest and handles like it's like an aggregate place for a lot of the Northwest producers. it's a retailer that handles a lot of that stuff as well. But I think during the pandemic, like producers have definitely switched to making themselves much more DTC as restaurants and wholesale accounts kind of dried up. People are definitely switching to more and more DTC because these smaller distributors that are handling cider were definitely the ones that got hurt the most and are the ones having cash flow issues. So cider definitely gets lost in that shuffle. So more and more producers are definitely going as much DTC as possible.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that now online. You can find lots of cool stuff, and it's a great experiment and find things and it's fun to order cider from. We just got a case of cider that Craig's house are now delivered from San Diego, which is really really exciting. And that cider that we would never, the small producer in San Diego, we would never. He barely sells it outside of San Diego. Sells it a couple places up in the Bay Area, but that's it. And it's really fun to kind of taste those products and buy stuff from buying stuff from Minnesota and from Colorado, these small producers, and to really have fun with those things. So that's really where I think where it's at right now is there are lots of these small producers doing really interesting stuff, and it's pretty affordable to buy it online still, and shipping isn't that expensive. Once you aggregate it over a case of wine, it's not that much money.
Right. I think that's a really, really smart point that our non-industry listeners won't necessarily automatically come to about the distributors kind of getting hurt by the pandemic. That's definitely something that I've seen here. It's certainly the case here in the Mid-Atlantic region, and so I think knowing that and going back to our conversation about the profitability of fruit ferments and distillates that we had earlier in the interview here, I think if I'm looking to not only find the coolest stuff, but also have the most positive impact on the economic side of things, I would certainly be looking to go direct to consumer or go direct to the producer as a consumer to have that positive impact, certainly. But yeah, there are certainly here in DC some great liquor stores and places like Ace Beverage and Schneider's over on Capitol Hill that do good work with lots of different varied ciders and do ship. So we'll have links to some of those books that you mentioned over on the show notes page at modernbarcart.com/podcasts. And of course, we'll have links to be able to pre-order American Cider as well. Is there anything you guys want to just mention before we move on to the lightning round here?
Cider is a really interesting space, and it's a really fun. And once you get sucked in, it's so much fun. The cider people are super great and are really really cool.
Yeah, shared cause. Drink more cider.
Awesome. All right, first lightning round question. What is your favorite cocktail? After all, this is a cocktail podcast. And if you don't have a favorite cocktail of all time, what's something maybe you've recently fallen in love with?
I used to drink a lot of Negronis back in the day, and I drink less of them now. Now I drink a lot of eau de. I drink a lot of mezcal and eau de vie, just straight at night because that's it.
Yeah. I'm on a forever quest to find my favorite cheap bourbon. Keeps me busy. It could be a never-ending find and a lifelong pursuit, but yeah.
What's your cocktail though?
New interest in the Bicicleta. Punch brought it to my light. I hadn't heard of it before, but Campari white wine and seltzer sounds right up my alley. Once it warms up a bit, I think I'm gonna live off those.
Punch has been, I would say, slaying recently with some of their articles about just cocktails that you would not have otherwise heard of. They've been it's been a parade of hits. So I would recommend that anybody who wants to do some good reading just head over to Punch and see what they've been publishing recently, because I've been enjoying it. All right. Is there any product or trend in the beverage world, knowing that you guys were both in the beverage world in sort of different capacities over the years, any trends recently that you feel are underrated or underappreciated?
Rum. That's my thing. I worked briefly when consulting for a place that had a pretty big rum program a couple years ago, and it was so much fun to just go through that. And I understand knowledge of it, but just going through and tasting all that stuff and finding all these really interesting things. And Craig and I have a colleague from an old colleague of ours from Haiti who tells all these stories of these like all these crazy like moonshine operations in Haiti. And then like when we saw the Clarions come to the market a couple years ago, like, oh yeah, he's like, oh yeah, this is basically what we have at home. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
So, and like that's, I think, underrated and underappreciated, especially like now that mezcal is priced where it should be, or still undervalued but not as cheap. I think rum is a fun way to get terroir and spirits.
Oh yeah.
And less so for me, unless I can beat the dead horse and just talk about cider being underrated.
Yeah, for sure. I love rum, and I do think, when during our conversation today, I did find myself thinking about the agave world and the cane spirit world in terms of the slipperiness of terroir. So that's interesting. My friend Chase Babcock, who is bringing St. Benevolence Clarin to the U.S. He talks about different cane varietals as well, and so I think just like the apple varietal conversation is going to be perhaps increasing in volume, I think that the cane varietals conversation is also going to be something that we start thinking about and hearing about from the rum world, hopefully in the next couple of years. So that's a lot of fun.
Cool.
Do you have any unusual or controversial beliefs in the beverage world, be it, cider, of course, but we can also extend that to beer, wine, cider, spirits, hospitality in general? Any controversial or unique views that you hold?
I don't know if it's controversial or not at this point in time, but like I definitely am reacting against the rise of beer that I don't like. Against beers that are milkshakey or too much intense like that, or that style. Like I have one of the importers here in New York imports amazing, delicious small producers from Germany, and I drink a lot of that stuff, which is much more fun for me than really like as we experiment and try all these crazy weird things from in the wine world and cider world. I do like very classic style beer.
And I'll second that as well, just in that, like, I sort of, as I was coming to discover cider and seek it out a bit more, I was kind of in tandem with this like palate fatigue from drinking so many IPAs. It was a welcome shift.
I love exploring that stuff, but it's one exploring in a different way.
Sure.
And I think in terms of hospitality, like it's changing. Our industry hasn't changed in generations. It's been the same business model, and now we're having to change it for the first time ever. So we need to adapt and change.
Yeah. Well, I do tend to agree that we have reached peak milk stout, and if I see another beer can with like a dessert food on it, I'm gonna pull my hair out. But yeah. So, gents, this has been a lot of fun. I think my takeaway overall is that cider is fun, intimidating, a little weird in some respects if we put our wine sunglasses on, and certainly holds a lot of opportunity as we progress here and see more of these fun varietals becoming more available to producers and to consumers. So I'm looking forward to keeping my eye on the cider scene here. I can't recommend your book enough. The advanced copy that I received was a whole lot of fun to go through, especially if, like me, you grew up, reading Tolkien and enjoying maps in books. I think they'll really get a kick out of what you were able to put together. How can people best pick up a copy of this book or pre-order it? I know that there are a couple different ways to go about that.
Yeah, you can go to at Penguin Random House. They have a selection of books retailers you can select from. Anyone sells it, Barnes and Noble, Amazon. The local bookstore will buy it, sell it to you as well. Or if you like Indigo, they'll all purchase it. And then in terms of other stuff, we do have a really cool. We started like a social media Instagram account called. We actually got American Cider or America_cider. It has lots of interesting. We're posting to like really interesting. Deep dives into different parts of cider and going into that a little more in depth about either like I think we're doing one this week about the fail orchards of Montana and the boom and bust of those things, which are one of the weirder stories we found along the way.
Yeah, fascinating. Frank Lloyd Wright was involved. It's cool. It's really neat.
All right. Well, head on over to that Instagram account, American_cider. And we'll have links to not only that account, not only to the Penguin Random House aggregate of all the places where you can pick up your copy of American Cider, but also to some of the resources and things that we mentioned here as well. So Dan and Craig, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Eric.
Cool. Thanks, Eric.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's two big things you can do for us here at Modern Bar Cart. One would be to tell your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy listening to us talk about cocktails. And if they don't download podcasts, they can always stream our episodes on their desktop directly from the show notes page at modernbarcart.com. The other thing you can do to help would be to head on over to iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. 5 stars are great, but we're more interested in your feedback. And the beauty is, the more reviews we have, the easier it will be for other folks out there to learn about our show. We're trying to start a cocktail revolution here, and by spreading the word, you're helping us fight the good fight. You can always reach us by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com if you're looking for cocktail or bartending advice, or if you're a pro who would like to pull up a mic and be interviewed for all to hear. Also, definitely follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Modern Bar Cart for cocktail porn, recipes, and entertaining tips. And keep an eye out for new product releases and special offers, which are happening all the time. We love our listeners, and we really enjoy giving you exclusive discounts and sneak peeks at our latest and greatest cocktail projects. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and adventures are just beginning, so remember, folks, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was produced by Edie Frederick, with editing and sound design by Samantha Reed, apple and cider insights, courtesy of Craig Cavallo and Dan Pucci, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Modern Bar Cart production, copyright 2021.